Redford has lost more than most hearts could ever endure. Behind the golden image of a Hollywood icon lies the shattered silence of a man who has buried not one but two of his own children. He has stood at the edge of graves no parent should ever face. His soul bruised by tragedies the world was never meant to see. As the world applauded, he mourned in private. As cameras captured his charm, sorrow tightened around him like a shadow. What hidden heartbreak shaped the man behind those iconic eyes? What scars does he carry as he nears 90? Not from age, but from loss too deep to name. What kind of pain can a lifetime of applause never silence? What happened behind the fame that turned triumph into quiet torment? And how does a man who once had everything now face the weight of everything he has lost? So stay with us as we pull back the curtain on the very beginning of the tragedies that would come to define his life. Robert Redford was born on August 18, 1936, in the Golden Cradle of Santa Monica, California. But destiny had no intention of granting him a golden childhood. He came into the world as the son of Charles Redford, a man worn by labor, and Martha Hart, a woman whose love ran so deep it would ultimately cost her everything. She believed in her son before anyone else did, before he was famous, before he was admired. And it was that kind of love that would one day break him in ways he never recovered from. When Robert was just 18, the unthinkable happened. His mother, his anchor, his quiet sanctuary, was taken from him in a moment that left his soul screaming in silence. Martha had dared to hope for more children, even as doctors warned her of the danger. And in that hope, she unknowingly gave her life away. She carried twin girls who never lived to see daylight, and in trying to provide them with life, she surrendered her own. The blood disorder that stole her was merciless, but the grief it unleashed inside her son was even more cruel. It was not just death that came that day. It was the annihilation of innocence, the shattering of safety, the beginning of a lifelong ache that no amount of applause or fame could ever drown out. He did not just lose his mother. He lost the one person whose eyes had never doubted him, the one voice that would never return. And worst of all, he carried a guilt that clawed at him for decades. The unbearable knowledge that he had taken her presence for granted wasted her final years in the arrogance of youth, and never told her the things she most deserved to hear. That regret would not fade. It would calcify inside him, a permanent fracture beneath every smile, every red carpet, every moment of so-called triumph. Her death was not just an end. It was the brutal, irreversible beginning of a man forever haunted by the love he could never reclaim. The sudden loss of his mother tore through Robert Redford's youth like a storm without warning, not loud, but utterly destructive. He did not scream, and he did not collapse, but something in him broke, quietly, deeply, and forever. In that moment on, he walked through life unanchored, carrying the weight of a sorrow no one could see, and even fewer could understand. With no hand left to guide him, no voice to hold him steady, he slipped into a world of risk and ruin, not to rebel, but to survive the silence. He sought danger like it was medicine, flirted with recklessness as if it might numb the ache that had rooted itself in his soul. This was not a phase. It was a cry for help, buried beneath a teenage heart too proud to speak and too shattered to stay still. And just as the world seemed ready to consume him, a fragile opportunity appeared. A baseball scholarship to the University of Colorado, a thread of structure and redemption. For a brief moment, hope flickered. But tragically, even that slipped through his fingers. Alone on campus, swallowed by a freedom he was not ready for, Robert once again found himself unraveling, not out of rebellion, but out of unbearable emptiness. He turned to distractions that numbed more than they healed, lost in the echo of a mother's absence and the pain of goodbyes never spoken. The cost was staggering. He lost the scholarship, the direction, the fragile identity he had tried to rebuild. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was slow, heavy, and excruciating, like watching light fade inch by inch. But in that darkness, something else began to take shape. Not a thirst for fame, but a hunger for truth, for meaning, for something real. So he left America, not chasing adventure, but fleeing a shadow. In Europe, among silent streets and quiet paintings, he saw something he had never seen before. Not just color, but clarity. Art became the only place where his pain made sense, where expression became salvation and survival became a story. When he returned, he was no longer a boy pretending to be whole. He was a man carved by loss, sobered by solitude, and awakened by truth. He did not return to chase applause. He returned to be heard. Because for Robert Redford, acting was never about being seen. It was about finally speaking the words that grief had long buried inside him. His return to America marked not just a shift in geography, but in destiny. What began as an artistic reawakening quietly evolved into a calling, one that would carry him from the silence of canvas to the roar of cinema. And just as the world began to discover Robert Redford the actor, he was already walking beside someone who had seen him long before, the fame, Lola Van Wagenen. In 1958, they married, two young souls clinging to hope, carrying more love than money, and dreaming of a life they would build together from almost nothing. They had only $300 to their name, but in each other they believed they had enough. And what neither of them could foresee was how quickly that dream would be tested and how brutally it would be broken. In 1959, just 1 year after their vows, tragedy tore through their home with the force of a silent scream. Their infant son, Scott, passed away in his sleep, only 10 weeks old. No warning, no explanation, just a cradle left cold, and two parents shattered in ways no words can reach. Robert would later call it one of the darkest moments of his life, a loss that left him questioning not only the future, but the fairness of the world itself. And while the cameras would one day capture his charm, his smile, his effortless cool, behind the scenes, he was a father standing over an impossibly small casket, asking the universe why. But grief, as it so often does, didn't end there. It lingered, clawed, and carved itself into the foundation of their marriage. They tried to keep going. They had to. And so they brought 3 more children into the world, Shauna, Jamie, and Amy. But even joy came at a cost. Jamie, their second son, was born prematurely, struggling to breathe, fighting for every second of life. Redford carried that fear in his bones, long after the doctors said he was stable. Because once you've buried a child, the fear of losing another never truly leaves. Jamie would face chronic illness again as a teenager, a quiet war with his own body that led to liver complications, 2 transplants, and years of uncertainty. Through it all, Robert was there, flying cross-country during filming, splitting himself between fatherhood and fame, trying to be everywhere, but feeling helpless all the same. And while the world celebrated his every success, which Cassidy, The Sting, The Way We Were, brought home, his marriage was quietly bleeding beneath the weight of too many sorrows left unspoken. Lola gave up her dreams to hold the family together, to be the steady presence, while Robert vanished into movie sets and hotel rooms. She carried the grief, the fear, the responsibility, and over time, it became too much to hold alone. In 1985, after 28 years of marriage, they separated, not in anger, but in exhaustion. Redford later called it mutual, but full of regret. Because sometimes love isn't loud when it breaks. Sometimes it simply fades under the weight of everything it was forced to carry. And just when it seemed life could not take anything more from him, Robert Redford was struck again. This time, in a way so cruel, so unspeakably painful, it shook the very core of his soul. In 2020, his beloved son Jamie, the man he once watched struggle to breathe as a newborn, the man who had survived the unimaginable and grown into a voice for truth and healing, was taken from him forever. After decades of fighting for every breath, after enduring surgeries, transplants, and years of uncertainty, Jamie's body could no longer go on, and his light, so full of purpose and compassion, quietly faded away. The world called it a passing, but for Robert it was a collapse of hope, of meaning, of the belief that maybe, just maybe, he had already suffered enough. It was not just sad, it was unbearable, it was not just tragic, it was shattering. And he did not cry out, he did not perform grief for the world to see. Instead, he withdrew into the only place that still felt sacred, the ranch in Utah, where his memories whispered and the wind remembered. There, alone among the silence, he mourned the loss of a son he could not protect, no matter how fiercely he tried. Jamie was not just family. He was a kindred spirit, a man who took the pain of his own body and turned it into fuel for compassion, storytelling, and change. And now, that flame was gone, leaving only ashes and questions too heavy to carry. What do you say to a man who has outlived not one but two of his children? What comfort can exist when even memory has become a knife? Redford, for all his fame, never wanted to be a legend. He only ever wanted to be a father who could protect his own. And in this, the most human of agonies, he was brought to his quietest truth. Some pain cannot be healed. Some losses are not meant to be spoken, only endured. And this one never let go. Curiosity is a very valuable thing, but you also want to be skeptical. But even after losing not one but two sons, even after watching both Scott and Jamie slip away in different decades, but with the same finality, the grief inside Robert Redford did not quiet down, because some wounds are not loud. They do not scream or bleed. They whisper in the dark, long after the world has moved on. One of those wounds came in 1983, when his daughter Shauna, his joy, his strength, lost the man she loved in a tragedy that remains unanswered to this day. Her fiancé, Sid Wells, was taken from her in a moment that shattered not just her future, but everything she believed about safety and fairness. And Redford, the father, the protector, the man who had already stood beside two graves marked with his sons' names, had to stand helpless once more, unable to fix, to shield, to make sense of a world that kept stealing from his family. The sorrow of watching his daughter mourn someone she thought would grow old beside her. It never left him. He did not talk about it often, but it lived behind his silence, behind the heavy pauses, behind the way his voice would sometimes tremble for no reason. As if that were not enough, life continued to carve pieces out of his soul. Natalie Wood, not just a colleague, but a kindred spirit, someone who had walked with him through the fragile beginnings of his career, was gone far too soon. The shock of her absence left a space no one could fill. She had believed in him when studios did not. She had stood beside him when he was just a name on a call sheet. Her loss was not just tragic. It was cruel. And then came Paul Newman, his brother not by blood, but by every other measure that mattered. The man who laughed with him, stood beside him in storms, whispered truth when fame was lying. When Paul was gone, Redford did not just lose a friend. He lost the last person who truly understood both the weight and the hollowness of being seen by the world, but never fully known. And that hollowness, that aching space between admiration and isolation, is something Redford has carried for decades. He once said that people looked at his face and forgot he was acting, that they saw the charm, the looks, the hair, but not the man. And while the world applauded, he sometimes stood off stage, wondering if the cheers were meant for him or for some idea of him that never truly existed. He was hailed as a legend, But inside, he was a quiet soul, fighting to stay human in a world that worships illusion. The pain of being misunderstood, not once, but for a lifetime, left marks deeper than fame could ever erase. Because, what do you do when success becomes its kind of prison? When does the spotlight blind more than it illuminates? And the very thing that made the world love you, slowly unmade you inside. These are the tragedies no camera captured, the slow, invisible kind. The ones that live behind the eyes, beneath the skin, in the pause between one breath and the next. And Robert Redford, for all his glory, has lived with those tragedies every single day. Now, as he quietly approaches his 90th year, Robert Redford lives not in the spotlight, but in the stillness he always longed for. The man once chased by flashing cameras and red carpets now wakes to the hush of mountain winds, the sound of horses, and the laughter of grandchildren echoing down quiet paths. He has traded fame for family, premieres for peace, and in doing so, he has finally found something even more significant than applause: wholeness. He no longer acts for the camera, but he still tells stories, not through scripts, but through every silent kindness, every gentle look, every moment of presence. His days are slower now, but never hollow, because his life, though marked by loss, has become a living testament to resilience. To the world, he is the Sundance Kid, the Great Gatsby, the golden boy of American cinema. But to those who know his story, he is so much more. He is the father who never left his children's bedsides, the husband who loved through sorrow, the friend who stood still when everyone else vanished. And above all, he was the artist who refused to let Hollywood's illusions define him. Through the Sundance Institute, he gave a voice to the voiceless, championing filmmakers with something real to say, long before the term independent film became fashionable. He fought for stories that mattered, for people overlooked, for truth whispered through art, and through his environmental work, he became a steward of the earth, protecting the very forests and rivers that now surround his final chapter with comfort and quiet strength. Robert Redford has never needed a crown, because his greatness was never about ruling a stage, but about living a life with soul, a life that endured, that gave, that stood its ground, with quiet fire. And now, in the golden twilight of his years, he remains not a shadow of who he was, but the most whole version of himself, shaped by pain, lit by purpose, and at last finally free from the roles he was never meant to keep. In a world obsessed with noise and newness, he is a whisper that lingers. To many, Robert Redford at nearly 90 is a symbol of admiration, a living testament to longevity, legacy, and a life filled with triumphs. But if you look closely into his eyes, if you pay attention to how quietly he chooses to live these final years, you will see this is not a sad life. It is a life carrying so many wounds. There is simply no space left to pretend to be strong anymore. He was once the brightest symbol of Golden Age Hollywood, a man who lit up the screen just by walking into frame. But the higher his star rose, the lonelier he became. The more he was adored, the more he felt misunderstood. People loved his hair, his eyes, his smile, but they did not see the man quietly standing between the graves of his two sons, the man who listened helplessly as his daughter cried over a love she would never grow old with, the man who swallowed loss after loss until it filled every silent corner of his heart. His life today may not be glamorous. There are no awards, no stages, no flashing lights, but it is in that very stillness that Robert Redford now lives as a mirror to the hardest truth of all, that some wounds never heal, that some pain is not meant to be explained, but to be carried until the very end. The way he lives now is not sad in the way the world usually defines it. It is sadness that is beautiful, quiet and dignified, Like the golden light falling over the Utah mountains, he calls home. It does not scream, it does not ask for pity, but it stops you in your tracks and makes you listen with your soul. This is a man who once had everything: fame, beauty, love, success, brotherhood, and who then lost nearly everything that ever gave those things meaning. And through it all, he did not rage. He did not collapse. He did not run. He simply stepped aside from the world that once crowned him a legend, to listen to the wind, to speak with memory, and to live out the rest of his life on his own terms, no longer performing, no longer pretending, no longer forcing himself to shine. Robert Redford, at almost 90, is not a symbol of sadness. He is a symbol of a heart that never truly broke, even after being cracked to its core. And maybe, just maybe, that is why we will remember him forever. Not because he was once the most beautiful man in Hollywood, but because he lived a life that never hid the things that made him truly human. If his journey ever touched you, if his films or his silence ever made you feel less alone, we invite you to leave a tribute below, in honor of a soul who never stopped enduring, even when the spotlight faded away.